It is evident that current opportunities and modalities for participation do not sufficiently accommodate indigenous peoples or empower our representative institutions. As we move forward, it is our collective responsibility to address these inadequacies, to open the doors of global decision-making, and to ensure that the voices of indigenous peoples are finally heard, respected, and integrated into the global community.
This is the Go Maluku podcast.
Good morning. We'll start the meeting. Distinguished members of the forum, distinguished observers and friends, ladies and gentlemen, the forum will now begin its consideration of item 6, entitled Future Work of the Permanent Forum, including issues considered by the Economic and Social Council, the outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples and Emerging Issues. We will begin by listening to our invited speakers here on the podium, to be followed by a general discussion on the item, based on inscription on the list of speakers for this item. I now have the pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speakers. Mr. Gam Shimray, Indigenous Coordinating Body, and Ms. Julianne Akoro, Commissioner, Culture and Family Affairs, Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development of Uganda. I now invite Mr. Gam Shimray, Indigenous Coordinating Body, to take the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished members of the Permanent Forum, esteemed delegates and fellow Indigenous peoples. Our histories and cultures, wisdom and aspirations have all played an integral role in shaping the world we inhabit. However, for far too long, our voices have been stifled, our perspectives dismissed at the United Nations. Today, we discuss our arrival at an opportunity to ensure that indigenous peoples can take our rightful place at the table of global decision-making. The enhanced participation processes for indigenous peoples' representative institutions at the United Nations has emerged as a beacon of hope. This transformative initiative bestows a new and distinct status for indigenous peoples at the United Nations General Assembly. The new status will amplify our voices and perspectives through our own governments, parliaments, and assemblies, including our traditional councils and authorities. Anchored in the Alta Outcome document, this process is guided by the principles of self-determination, solidarity, empowerment, and respect, the UN Declaration, and the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples Outcome document. Chair, we all know that one cannot move forward without having learned valuable lessons from the past. We remember the courageous leaders who nearly a century ago embarked on a journey to defend the rights of indigenous peoples on the international stage. In 1923, Haudenosaunee Descahe, Levy General, traveled to Geneva to advocate for their rights at the League of Nations. In 1925, Maori leader Ratana embarked on a similar quest. Both were denied access, but their endeavors ignited a flame that continues to burn in the hearts of indigenous peoples, fueling our pursuit for justice and recognition under international law, including the right to self-determination. One might assume that nearly 100 years after the journey of the Descahe and others, the global community would have rectified these shortcomings. Regrettably, the current consultative and participatory status of the United Nations remain inadequate for indigenous peoples. The only available category for participation is that of non-governmental organizations, which fails to recognize the true status of indigenous governments. If a leader like Descahe were to address the United Nations today, they would have forced to do so as a delegate of an NGO, a role that diminishes our sovereignty and self-determination, something they and other indigenous governments would rightfully so refuse. In its emerging wisdom, the United Nations starts to recognize that indigenous peoples possesses invaluable wisdom and perspectives honed since time immemorial. Indigenous peoples' capacity to contribute to peace and the resolution of global challenges is well established. Unfortunately, our voices are often silenced or confined to discussions on indigenous issues, a limited scope that fails to recognize the broader potential of indigenous contributions to the world. My fellow indigenous peoples, we are all gathered here in New York to address the pressing issues faced by indigenous peoples worldwide. These include a lack of recognition that hampers our ability to defend our rights at political venues, forced eviction from our territories for reasons such as sustainable development, conservation, or climate change adaptation, and exploitation of our lands, territories, and resources. We also face challenges within the United Nations, such as being unable to address relevant agenda items at meetings, having to register as NGOs, limited access to meetings that directly affect you, inability to intervene in consultations on draft decisions and resolutions, not being allowed to propose agenda items, and being unable to submit documents and communications relating to the work of the General Assembly, Human Rights Council, or Conference of Parties. It is evident that current opportunities and modalities for participation do not sufficiently accommodate indigenous peoples or empower our representative institutions. As we move forward, it is our collective responsibility to address these inadequacies, to open the doors of global decision-making, and to ensure that the voices of indigenous peoples are finally heard, respected, and integrated into the global community. That is why I address you today in my capacity as Asia representative of the Indigenous Coordinating Body. The ICB enjoys the mandate from the collective will of indigenous peoples that gathered in Quito, Ecuador in 2020. And it is entrusted with the crucial task of facilitating indigenous peoples' engagement in this process for a new status. Composed of at least 2 members from each of the 7 socio-cultural regions, we foster consultation, coordination, and cooperation among indigenous peoples, focusing on creating this new status within the United Nations. Firstly, by promoting the inclusion of indigenous peoples in global policy making and decision making, we ensure that the unique perspectives, knowledge, and wisdom of indigenous peoples are brought to the forefront of international discussions. This broadened participation will lead to more comprehensive, informed, and culturally sensitive policies, creating a more inclusive and sustainable world for all. Secondly, through our work, we aim to strengthen partnerships between indigenous governments and states. By fostering collaboration and mutual respect, the